I heard her before I ever saw her, and for 3 nights I told myself it was the tide working loose boards under the drowned slip. That's the condemned stretch at the far end of Saltmere Docks, the pier that folded in a storm 9 years back, and never got rebuilt because the harbor authority didn't want to spend the money, and nobody with any sense wanted to go under there and find out why the pilings still groaned at low tide. I had no business down there. I was 58 years old, 3 months behind on my slip fees, and 1 bad shift away from losing the crane job I'd held for 20 years. I went anyway, because the sound wasn't boards, it was breathing. I found her wedged into the collapsed underside of the pier, where the tide doesn't fully reach, folded around herself in a space too small for what she was. Slate-gray scales dulled with salt crust, 1 wing torn through in 2 places, a gash along her flank that had stopped bleeding only because there wasn't much blood left to give. Her eyes were the size of dinner plates, and they opened when my lantern found her, and I want to say I ran. I didn't. I don't know why I didn't. I've turned that over more times than I can count since, and the truest answer I've got is that she looked at me the way a man looks at you when he's already decided you're not worth the trouble of being afraid of. There was no threat left in her. Just an old, patient tiredness, and underneath it, something that might have been relief that I hadn't screamed and run for the harbor watch. I didn't run for the watch. I went home, and I came back with a bucket of mackerel from my own icebox, and a jug of fresh water, and I set them down at the edge of what light my lantern threw, and I backed off, and I waited. She didn't move for a long while. Then, slow as a door swinging shut in reverse, she reached out 1 clawed hand, more hand than paw, long-fingered, black-taloned, and drew the bucket toward herself, and ate like something that hadn't in longer than I wanted to think about. I kept it up. Every night after my shift, before the harbor watch made their second pass, I'd carry down what I could scrounge. Fish, sometimes a haunch of something from the butcher who never asked questions because I paid cash and didn't linger. I packed the worst of her wounds with clean rags and boiled water, though she flinched so hard the first time I touched the wing that I nearly lost 2 fingers to instinct, not malice. She never made a sound I'd call a threat. Once, maybe the second week, she made a low sound in her chest when I sat down across from her instead of leaving straight off, and it took me an embarrassing while to understand it was something like a request, so I stayed. I told her about the crane, about my wife who'd been gone 6 years now, about the dock authority breathing down my neck over fees I couldn't pay, because I kept spending my grocery money on mackerel for a dying dragon under a condemned pier. She listened the way you'd listen to weather, patient, unbothered by the smallness of it, which was its own kind of grace, now that I think on it. It cost me. Fenwick, who ran the dock authority office, started asking where half my pay was going, and when I wouldn't say, he started saying words like smuggling and suspension out loud where the other men could hear. I lost sleep I couldn't afford to lose, working the crane on 4 hours a night for going on a month. I didn't care. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't nobility, or, not only that, somewhere in the 3rd week, I understood that I would rather lose the job than lose the 2 hours I spent each evening sitting in the dark with something enormous and ancient that had decided, for reasons I never fully understood, that I was safe. She was healing, some, slow, and never enough that I stopped being afraid I'd come down one night and find her gone the way that kind of gone doesn't come back from. The wing wouldn't close right. She'd try sometimes, stretching it out along the wet stone, and it would hang wrong, and she'd fold it back in with a patience that had teeth in it, if you knew how to look. Word got round the fishing fleets before I understood what I was hearing. Men talked about something big moving under the old pier at night, about a shadow in the water off the slip that had capsized nobody but scared plenty. By the time I heard it second-hand at the dockside tavern, it had already grown claws and a taste for boats that didn't belong to it. I should have known that kind of talk travels further than a harbor. I didn't think it through. I was too tired, and too far gone in something I didn't have a name for yet, to think about who else might be listening past the fishermen. They came on a gray morning, 6 of them, and I knew before I saw a single scale that they weren't harbor watch. They moved wrong for that. Too quiet, too sure, armor that didn't clink because it wasn't built to. Their leader was a broad woman with a scar bisecting one eyebrow and a crest stamped into her shoulder plate that I didn't recognize then. Ashcoil Dominion, she told me later. They'd come hunting a beast terrorizing the strait, and they meant to put it down before it moved on to open water and became someone else's problem. I was on my knees in the mud of the slip when they found the entrance, one hand on Vrenoth's foreleg where I'd been trying to talk her through the pain of a wound reopening, and I didn't have time to do anything but turn and put myself between 6 armed strangers and a dying animal who trusted me not to let anyone hurt her worse than she already was. It wasn't bravery. I want to be clear about that too. It was just where my body went. Nobody drew a blade. That's the part I still turn over at night. 6 of them, come to kill a monster, and every one of them went still as stone the second their eyes crossed her face. The commander, Torvin Ash, she gave me her name later, like it mattered to her that I have it, went down on one knee in 6 inches of tidal mud in her Dominion armor, and I heard the breath go out of her like she'd been struck. "Warden," she said, and her voice cracked clean in half on the word. Vrenoth lifted her head off the stone for the first time in 9 days. It cost her something to do it. I felt the effort in the foreleg under my hand. They told me the rest later, sitting on overturned crates while a Dominion healer worked on the wing with tools I'd never seen, and Vrenoth watched me the whole time, like she was making sure I didn't leave. Vrenoth had been the first warden of the Dominion's northern reach, 3 generations gone missing during a storm that had taken half a fleet with her, presumed dead so long her name had passed into the kind of story you tell children to explain why the coastline is shaped the way it is. She'd been alive the whole time, wounded past flying, too proud or too broken to be found by the ones who might have pitied her, and she'd crawled into the smallest, darkest hole she could find, to do it in private, the way old things sometimes do. They didn't ask me why I'd fed a stranger under a condemned pier for a month on a crane operator's wage. Ash just looked at the mackerel bucket stacked against the wall, worn thin from washing and reuse, and looked at me, and didn't say anything at all, which told me more than words would have. Fenwick dropped the smuggling talk the same week. Once word got round that a Dominion envoy had personally walked into his office to settle my slip fees for the next 2 years without being asked. I didn't request it. I wouldn't have known how. I found out from the other crane men, who wouldn't stop asking what I'd done to earn a dragon's gratitude, and I never had a good answer for them beyond the true one, which was nothing much. I fed something that was hungry. I stayed when it would have been easier not to. Vrenoth flew again, eventually, though the wing never sat quite even, and she told me once, the only time I ever heard her speak more than a handful of words, that she'd keep it that way on purpose, so she'd remember the shape of the pier she'd almost died under, and the man who hadn't run. I still work the crane. I still walk past the drowned slip most evenings on my way home, though there's nothing under there now but tide and old pilings. Sometimes I stop anyway, and stand at the edge of the broken planking, and I don't feel foolish about it the way I once might have. A man spends most of his life being told his kindness is worth exactly what it costs him, and not a scale more. I know better now. I know it can be worth more than that to somebody, even if you never once expect it to be worth anything at all.